Somewhere in the middle of the American century, in the years when radios hummed from kitchen shelves and the country was just beginning to pull itself out of a decade of genuine hardship, there existed a day of the week that women across the nation greeted with a particular kind of dread. Not the sharp dread of something dangerous, not the cold dread of bad news, but the heavy, bone-knowing dread of a task so enormous, so physically consuming, so utterly inescapable, that it reorganized the entire rhythm of a household around itself. That day was Monday. And on Monday, you did the laundry. This isn't a story about washing machines, exactly, though washing machines will appear. It isn't a story about soap, though soap matters more than you might expect. It's a story about labor, the invisible, exhausting, largely uncelebrated labor that kept American families clothed, presentable, and socially acceptable at a time when being clean meant something very different than it does today. It's a story about water and heat and time and the particular ache that settled into a woman's shoulders by noon and didn't leave until Thursday. It's a story about what it meant to keep a house, to keep a family, to keep up appearances in 1940 America, when the war hadn't quite arrived yet, when electricity was still a novelty in some corners of the country, and when the distance between a clean shirt and a dirty one could mean the difference between a man keeping his job or losing it. We'll move slowly through this world. There's no reason to rush. The story itself is about endurance, after all, about the long, slow work of getting through a thing that cannot be rushed. So settle in. Let the details come to you at their own pace. Let the world of 1940 take shape around you, its particular smells, its textures, its small but relentless demands. We begin before sunrise. We begin, as laundry day always did, with water. Part 1: Before the sun. The alarm, if there was one, rang early on Monday. But in most households in 1940, the woman of the house didn't need an alarm for laundry day. Her body knew. The anticipation of what lay ahead was enough to pull her out of sleep while the sky outside was still the color of pewter. She dressed quickly. There was no point in putting on anything decent. Whatever she wore today would be soaked through by mid-morning. The first order of business, always, without exception, was water, hot water, and a lot of it. In the farmhouses of rural Tennessee, or the mill towns of upstate Pennsylvania, or the small cities of the Midwest, water was not a simple thing, even in homes that had running water. And in 1940, a surprising number of American homes still did not getting enough hot water for a full laundry was not a matter of turning a tap. It was a project, a production. It required forethought, preparation, and usually at least an hour of active effort before the washing itself could begin. For rural families, the first step was often the well or the hand pump in the yard, and water was hauled in buckets, sometimes dozens of trips worth, into the kitchen or the wash house out back. In towns and small cities, running water was more common, but the hot water heater, if the home had one, held perhaps 30 or 40 gallons. A serious laundry needed far more than that. You supplemented, you boiled. You filled every large pot in the kitchen and set them on the stove, and you waited while they came to temperature, and you watched the clock because the stove also needed to be doing other things, and the children needed breakfast, and none of this waited for any of the others. The cookstove in 1940 was not an optional appliance. In many homes it was wood or coal burning, and it generated heat whether you wanted it to or not. In summer this was its own particular misery. In the colder months, and laundry day happened in all seasons, there was at least the compensation of warmth. You loaded the firebox and listened to the wood catch and felt the radiant heat begin to fill the kitchen, and you moved the heavy pots over the burners, and the morning assembled itself around the sound of water slowly beginning to move. The pots were heavy. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to skim past the physicality of all this and miss what it actually felt like. A stock pot filled with water weighs somewhere between 20 and 40 pounds depending on its size. Moving it from the pump to the stove, from the stove to the wash basin, from the wash basin to wherever the wringer was set up, this was not light work. This was not incidental. Women in 1940 who did their own laundry regularly had forearms and shoulders that testified to it. The work was physical in a way that is difficult to fully convey to someone who has only ever moved wet clothes from a drum to a dryer. By 6 in the morning, maybe 6:30, the water was beginning to heat. The children were stirring. The day was fully, irreversibly underway. Part 2: The sorting. There's a kind of order to laundry that most people today have completely abandoned. We tend to sort roughly darks from lights maybe, and then load everything into the machine and walk away. The sorting done by an American housewife in 1940 was a different kind of operation altogether. It was a taxonomy. careful experience-based classification system that had been passed down from mothers to daughters for generations, and that had very specific reasons behind every category. The clothes came down from bedrooms, from laundry bags hung on the backs of doors, from the hamper in the hallway if the family was prosperous enough to have one. They were laid out on the kitchen table or on the floor of the washroom, and she sorted them into piles with a practiced eye and hands that didn't need to think very hard about any of this anymore. First, the whites: dress shirts, undershirts, pillowcases, the good tablecloth if it needed doing, handkerchiefs, certain undergarments. These were the priority load. They would go into the hottest water with the most soap, and they would be washed first before the water had a chance to become gray and murky with the dirt and residue of the loads before. This mattered enormously. The order of washing was not arbitrary. It was a hierarchy built on practical logic, the logic of shared water in a time when water itself was not infinite or free. Hot water required fuel to heat. Fuel cost money or effort or both. You did not waste a tub of good hot soapy water on work clothes if you could first run the whites through it. The whites, when in pristine water, were scrubbed and wrung and then set aside. Then the light colors. Then the darker things. Then the work clothes, the overalls, the things that had been out in the fields or the factory or the yard. By the time you got to the last load, the water in the tub was a remarkable color, a kind of gray-brown that spoke to just how much grime the previous loads had surrendered. Second, the coloreds, as they were universally called: dresses, shirts in blue or brown or green, children's everyday clothes. These needed somewhat cooler water than the whites, partly to prevent bleeding of dyes that were often not particularly stable, and partly because hot water was starting to be less abundant by this point. Third, the heavy items: overalls, work pants, the husband's farm clothes or factory clothes. These required the most scrubbing and the least delicacy. They also required the most physical effort to wring out afterward, since denim in particular holds water like a small reservoir. Fourth, the bedding: sheets, pillowcases in greater quantity, the heavier items that needed an entire tub's attention. And finally, if there was one, and there often was, especially if the household included young children or anyone who had been ill, the rags. The cleaning cloths, the scraps, the things that were washed not because they were precious but because they were functional and couldn't be wasted. Each of these categories had its own requirements in terms of temperature, soap concentration, and handling time. A woman doing laundry in 1940 carried all of this in her head without thinking of it as skill, because skill that is entirely domestic and entirely performed by women tends not to be named as skill. It was just something you knew. It was just what you did. Part 3: the soap question. The soap used on laundry day in 1940 was not what you find today in those colorful plastic jugs, pre-measured and pleasantly scented. In many households, particularly rural ones and those where Depression-era thrift had become a permanent habit of mind, the soap was homemade. Or it was a large, unadorned bar of commercial laundry soap. Fell's naphtha was among the most common, a brownish-yellow brick that smelled of naphtha and something medicinal, and that was sold wrapped in paper at the general store or the 5-and-dime. It was not subtle. It was not pleasant. It was effective. Fell's naphtha had been around since the 1890s, and by 1940 it occupied a nearly universal place in American laundry rooms. Its smell was distinctive enough that several generations of Americans would later find themselves unexpectedly transported to their childhoods by encountering it in a hardware store. It was sold on the premise that it could remove almost anything: grease, blood, grass stains, the particular grime of farm work, and this was not entirely marketing. The soap worked. It worked because it was strong, and because the women using it were experienced, and because the combination of strong soap and very hot water and vigorous mechanical action could defeat most things that ended up on a garment in the course of ordinary American life. You grated the bar soap, or you shaved it with a knife, and you dissolved it in hot water before adding the clothes. This was not optional. Adding undissolved soap directly to a wash load left streaks and residue that were difficult to remove, and that showed up on white fabrics in particular as yellowish or gray smears. The soap had to be melted, integrated, become part of the water before the clothes went in. Some women made their own soap. This was a tradition that stretched back to the colonial period, and that had not entirely disappeared even by 1940, particularly in rural areas where resourcefulness was not a virtue but a necessity. Lye soap was made from wood ash and rendered animal fat, a process that required its own day of preparation, its own set of risks. Lye is genuinely caustic and will burn skin if handled carelessly, and its own quiet satisfaction when it came out right. The resulting soap was coarse, strong, and somewhat irregular, but it cleaned. Washing powder had existed in various forms since the mid-19th century. and by 1940 companies like Procter & Gamble were selling Oxydol and Does to a market that was beginning to shift away from bar soap. But the full conversion to powdered and later liquid detergent was still years away for most families. The bar soap, the grated flakes, the strong, simple chemistry of alkali and fat meeting grease and dirt, that was still the standard experience for most American households doing their washing. The smell of laundry soap was, for most people of this era, the smell of Monday. It permeated the house. It got into everything. By midday, even the bread rising on the counter had something of that soapy mineral edge to it, and your hands, no matter how many times you rinsed them, held a faint residue that lasted until evening. Part 4: The machine if you had one. Here is where the 1940 American laundry experience starts to fracture along the lines of class, geography, and luck. Because in 1940, whether you had a washing machine and what kind made an enormous difference to your Monday. The electric washing machine had existed in some form since the early 1900s. By 1940, roughly half of American households that had electricity also had a washing machine of some kind. This sounds promising until you realize that in 1940, a significant number of American homes, particularly rural ones, did not yet have electricity at all. The Rural Electrification Act had been passed in 1936, and the lines were spreading, but in 1940 the work was nowhere near complete. Somewhere between 10 and 30% of American farms still had no electrical service, depending on the region. Even among those who had electricity, the washing machine was not necessarily a given. It cost money. A decent electric washer in 1940 ran somewhere between $50 and $100, which was a substantial sum for a family whose household income might be somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. You had to decide whether a washing machine was a necessity or a luxury, and the answer depended on how many people were in your family, how dirty their work made them, and how strongly you felt about your back. The washing machines of 1940 bore very little resemblance to the sealed drums of today. They were most of them agitator machines, a metal or porcelain tub, usually cylindrical, with a central agitator that moved back and forth to move the clothes through the soapy water. They did not spin dry. They had no automatic cycles. You filled them manually with hot water that you had heated separately. You added the soap and then the clothes. You set the agitator running. The most common arrangement was an electric motor driving the agitation mechanism, and you listened to the rhythmic mechanical churning and the slosh of water and felt that this was, at least, better than a washboard. But the machine was not done with you once the agitation cycle finished. Now the clothes needed to be extracted from the soapy water, and here was the wringer. The wringer was a pair of rollers mounted above the tub, spring-loaded so they could be adjusted for different thicknesses of fabric, driven by the same electric motor as the agitator. You fed wet laundry through the rollers, which pressed out the water, which fell back into the tub or into a separate rinse tub if you had one positioned below. The rollers were effective. They were also, if you were careless, capable of pulling in your fingers along with the fabric. Wringer injuries were common enough in 1940 that they featured regularly in household safety literature of the period. Women warned their daughters about the wringer the way later generations would warn about other specific household hazards. A moment of inattention, a reaching gesture, a fold of fabric that pulled your hand along with it. The rollers did not distinguish between linen and fingers. The tub still had to be emptied and refilled for the rinse cycle. This was manual work, usually involving either a drain hose that you repositioned or a bucket brigade situation if the machine wasn't near a floor drain. The rinse water also had to be at least somewhat warm to help remove the soap residue from the fabric, which meant either preparing more heated water ahead of time or running the machine through a second fill cycle. If you did not have a washing machine, if you were in the roughly half of American households that lacked one, either from poverty or from living somewhere electricity hadn't reached yet, you washed by hand. Part 5: The washboard. The washboard is one of those objects that has become so thoroughly symbolic, so freighted with romantic associations about simpler times, that it's worth making a real effort to see it clearly. It was not a charming artifact. It was not quaint. It was a tool for a job that required sustained physical effort that would leave your knuckles raw and your arms burning, and your back aching in a way that the muscles between your shoulder blades seemed to hold onto for days. The washboard itself was simple. A wooden frame, usually about 2 feet tall and a foot wide, enclosing a corrugated surface made of zinc, glass, or in some cases tin. You set it in the bottom of a wash tub, a large round or oval tub made of galvanized metal or wood, with the corrugated surface angled down into the soapy water at roughly the right angle for you to lean over it while scrubbing. You took a piece of wet, soaped fabric, you pressed it against the corrugations, and you moved it back and forth against the ridges with enough force to dislodge the embedded dirt from the fibers. The motion is hard to explain to someone who has never done it. It's not quite scrubbing in the way we use that word. It's more like a focused application of pressure and friction, repeated dozens or hundreds of times on a single garment, then dozens of times more on the next garment, then the next. Your knuckles inevitably made contact with the corrugations. After an hour, this was uncomfortable. After 3 hours, it was painful. After a full day of it, which is what a full family wash required, the skin on the back of your hands was something you'd want to soak in warm water before you went to sleep. The water in the wash tub cooled as you worked. Cold water is dramatically less effective at removing grease and food stains than hot water, so you periodically had to add more hot water from the stove, which meant interrupting your washing to haul and pour and adjust. In winter, the wash house or back porch where this work often happened could be genuinely cold, which added a layer of genuine physical misery, your hands in the warm water, the air around you frigid, the steam rising from the tub and condensing on everything. A family of 4 or 5 generated perhaps 10 to 15 pounds of laundry per week: clothing, undergarments, work clothes, bedding, kitchen linens. On the washboard, this was many hours of work. There was no shortcut. There was no way to do it faster without doing it poorly, and doing it poorly had social consequences, as we'll get to. Part 6: The rinse. Getting the soap out of clothes was nearly as much work as putting it in. Soap residue left in fabric causes problems. It makes cloth feel stiff and slightly sticky. It attracts more dirt, so clean laundry that isn't well rinsed gets dirty faster than properly rinsed laundry. It can irritate skin, particularly the delicate skin of infants, which is why baby clothes were rinsed with particular care. And visually, under certain lighting, soap residue shows up as a faint gray or yellowish cast in white fabrics, the exact opposite of the bright clean white that laundry day was supposed to achieve. The rinse cycle in 1940 generally meant at least 2 separate rinse baths for each load of laundry. You lifted the soapy wet clothes from the wash water, an operation that required some physical strength since wet laundry is heavy and wanted to stay put, and you carried them dripping to a rinse tub or bucket or second wash tub. You pressed them down into clean water and agitated them by hand. You wrung them out. You did it again. If you had a wringer, you ran the clothes through the wringer between each rinse, which helped expel both the water and the soap. Some women used bluing in the final rinse. Bluing was a laundry additive, a small amount of blue dye or a blue-tinted liquid that counteracted the natural yellowing tendency of white fabrics. Cotton over repeated washings tends to develop a slightly yellow tone, particularly in areas of regular wear and washing. A small amount of blue in the rinse water counteracted this optically, making the whites appear more brilliantly white. This was not chemistry in any complicated sense. It was the same principle as why modern laundry detergents still contain optical brighteners. But it required judgment. Too much bluing turned your white shirts distinctly lavender, which was not the desired effect. You learned by experience how many drops into how much rinse water. Bluing also came in tablet form or as a small wrapped cake of compressed pigment, and the laundry sections of household management books from this period treat bluing with the same gravity they give to other critical decisions. The white shirts had to be right. The pillowcases had to be right. These were not decorative concerns, they were social necessities. Part 7: What clean meant. Let's pause here in the middle of all this water and soap and effort and ask a question that seems obvious but isn't. Why did it matter so much? Why was laundry day treated with such seriousness, such ritualized commitment, such willingness to endure a full day of physical labor every single week? The answer has several layers, and none of them are entirely about hygiene in the clinical sense. In 1940 America, cleanliness was a moral category as much as a physical one. This was not new. The Victorian era had refined this conflation of physical and moral cleanliness to a high art, but it was still very much operative in 1940, particularly in working-class and lower-middle-class communities where appearances were one of the few things people had genuine control over. You might not be able to control your income, your housing, the school your children attended, or the neighborhood you lived in. But you could control whether your family came out of the house in clean clothes. And that control, exercised visibly and consistently, was a form of self-presentation that carried real social weight. A man who went to work in a clean white shirt, properly laundered and ironed, was communicating something about himself and his household. He was communicating that he had a wife who was capable and industrious. He was communicating that his home was well ordered. He was communicating that he was, despite whatever financial difficulties the Depression had imposed or were still lingering in the early 1940s, a respectable person. This was worth a great deal. In a time before credit scores and formal HR departments and the various modern mechanisms of social evaluation, the cleanliness of a man's collar was a signal that people read with real attention. Children at school faced similar scrutiny. A child in dirty clothes was noticed. A child in clean, pressed clothes, even simple clothes, even plain clothes, even the same dress worn twice in a week was a child whose mother was doing her job. Teachers noticed. Neighbors noticed. The other children noticed. The social cost of failing the laundry standard was not abstract. For women, the stakes were even more direct. Keeping the laundry done properly was part of what defined a competent housewife in this period, and competent housewifery was a significant component of a woman's social standing. This sounds foreign to modern ears, but in 1940 the social world of most women was centered on the home and the immediate neighborhood in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct now. What your neighbors thought of you mattered intensely. Whether your sheets smelled clean when you hung them out mattered. Whether your husband's shirts had gray rings around the collars mattered. These were not trivial vanities. They were the metrics by which a woman's domestic competence was evaluated by herself and by everyone around her. This is part of why laundry day was dreaded rather than simply accepted as routine. The stakes were high, the work was hard, and there was no acceptable excuse for failing to do it. Part 8. The starch. Before the laundry was done, before the wringing and the rinsing and the hanging, there was starch. Starch was applied to certain garments during the laundry process to give them body, crispness, and a degree of stain resistance. A freshly starched and ironed shirt had a particular quality that can still occasionally be encountered: a crispness of fabric, a slight firmness to the collar and cuffs, a faint smooth surface that held its shape through the morning hours instead of going soft and limp the way unstarched cotton did. In 1940, starching was not optional for shirts worn to work or to church. It was simply part of finishing laundry correctly. Starch came in several forms. There was laundry starch in a powder or block form that you dissolved in cold water and then added to hot water to create a starch bath. You dipped the collar, the cuffs, the shirt front into the starch bath, pressed out the excess, and allowed the garment to dry in a slightly stiff state. When you ironed it later, the starch activated and set, producing that characteristic smoothness. There was also a practice called spray starching, dampening dried laundry with a starch solution before ironing, though this was more common in later decades. Getting the starch concentration right was another matter of experience. Too little starch and the garment didn't have the right feel. Too much, and you ended up with a shirt that was board-like, uncomfortable to wear, and that crackled audibly when the wearer moved his arms. A collar that was overstarched could also chafe the neck over the course of a day. You learned your household's preferences and calibrated accordingly. The starch bath was one more thing to heat, one more step in an already long process, one more opportunity for things to go slightly wrong in ways that would become apparent only on Tuesday morning when the ironing was done. Part 9. Hanging. Somewhere between mid-morning and noon on a good laundry day, the first load was wrung out and ready to hang. The clothesline was a standard feature of American yards in 1940, often multiple lines, sometimes elevated on tall poles to catch more wind, sometimes the classic two-post arrangement with multiple parallel lines strung between them, sometimes a rotating umbrella style if the family was modern and the yard was small. The lines themselves were usually cotton rope, though wire lines were also common, and had the advantage of not sagging as much under a heavy wet load. Hanging laundry on a line was not as simple as just pinning things up and walking away. There was method to it. You hung sheets by folding them over the line lengthwise and pinning at regular intervals so they wouldn't sag and drag on the ground. You hung shirts by the tail, not the shoulders, to prevent the shoulder seams from stretching out of shape under the weight of wet fabric. You hung socks in pairs. You hung pillowcases open end down so they dried from the inside out. You sorted what you hung where on the line so that similar items dried at similar rates and nothing was shaded from the sun longer than necessary. The wooden clothespins had to be clean. Dirty clothespins left marks on fabric which defeated the entire purpose. You kept the pins in a cloth bag that hung on the line or on your arm as you worked, and you replaced any pin that had split or cracked because a cracked pin could snag delicate fabric. The weather mattered enormously. A clear, breezy Monday was a gift. The laundry dried quickly, sometimes in 2 to 3 hours, and came off the line smelling of air and sunshine, which was a real smell, not a marketing invention. There's a genuine chemistry to sun-dried fabric, a combination of UV light and air circulation that produces something distinct from machine-dried cloth. People who experienced it regularly knew it immediately and found it pleasant. A cloudy Monday was workable. A windy Monday without rain was fine. But a rainy Monday was a household problem of some seriousness. Wet laundry that couldn't be hung outside had to be hung inside, which meant draping it over chairs and door frames and any available horizontal surface, which meant the house was humid and obstructed and the drying took much longer and the laundry smelled different, a faint mustiness rather than air and sun. A cold, damp day inside a house with laundry drying on every surface was its own special atmosphere, familiar to anyone who grew up in such a household. If it rained after you'd already hung the laundry, if the sky, which had looked clear enough at 10 in the morning, opened up at noon and soaked everything you'd carefully wrung and hung, you ran outside and grabbed what you could before it was too wet again, and you either brought it inside or you left it and hoped the rain stopped and the sun came back. Rain that hit already hung laundry wasn't entirely catastrophic, as long as it dried afterward with enough sunlight. But it added time, and time on laundry day was never something you had extra of. There was also the matter of neighbors. In a neighborhood of closely set houses with adjacent yards, your clothesline was visible. The quality and cleanliness of what you hung was observable by anyone who looked. Some women were competitive about this in a low-key, unacknowledged way. The whiteness of the sheets spoke for itself. The absence of gray tones in the white shirt said something. A line of well-hung, well-ordered laundry was a small public display of domestic competence. A line of gray, poorly wrung, haphazardly pinned laundry was a statement about the woman who hung it, whether she intended it to be or not. Part 10. What the children were doing. While all of this was happening, the heating of water, the scrubbing, the wringing, the hanging, the children existed in the household as both helpers and complications. Families with older children, typically daughters from about age 8 or 10 upward, laundry day was often a shared labor. An older daughter might be responsible for hauling water, for turning the wringer handle if the machine was hand-powered, for hanging the smaller items on the lower sections of the line. She was learning the work by doing it, which is how this knowledge had always been transmitted mother to daughter, doing alongside watching and then doing, until the daughter carried the full knowledge in her body. A girl of 12 in 1940 could be a meaningful contributor to laundry day, capable of taking on complete sections of the work, while her mother managed the more complex or physically demanding parts. This was not child labor in any sinister sense. It was the ordinary expectation of family life in a period when households were genuinely productive units, and the labor required to maintain them was distributed among the family members available. Younger children were a different matter. Small children underfoot on laundry day were a safety concern. The hot water, the wringer, the running machinery, all of these presented real hazards to curious 3-year-old. Women managed this by setting up play areas away from the washing equipment, by enlisting an older child to supervise younger ones, by timing the most dangerous phases of the work for when the small ones were napping. But it added cognitive load to an already demanding day. The split attention of monitoring a toddler while simultaneously managing a washtub of hot water and a load of wet sheets was its own kind of exhaustion. And then there was the issue of what the children did to the laundry. Children in 1940 were not particularly gentle with their clothes, and there was little expectation that they would be. Children played outside. Children played in yards and fields and muddy creeks. Children climbed things, fell off things, dragged things across unpaved surfaces. Grass stains were a constant. Mud was a constant. The particular reddish or brownish stain that came from playing in red clay soil, common across large sections of the South and Midwest, was a familiar enemy that yielded reluctantly to the washboard and soap. Summer meant watermelon juice and berry stains. Winter meant the gray ground-in dirt that came from playing in coats that weren't quite waterproof. The children's pile in the laundry sort was always among the most demanding, and there was a certain dark irony in the fact that the creatures who generated the most laundry were also the least equipped to understand why this mattered. Part 11. The Farm Wife's Monday. It would be a mistake to treat the 1940 laundry experience as uniform across all American households, because the differences were significant, and they mapped closely onto the differences between rural and urban life, between farm families and town families, between households that had electrified and those that hadn't. The farm wife doing laundry in 1940 was working in conditions that had more in common with the 19th century than with what we think of as mid-20th century life. On farms in the rural South and Appalachian communities in the more isolated parts of the Plains states, the absence of electricity was still entirely normal. The washing machine was not available to you. The wringer was hand-turned. The water came from a well or a pump. The heat came from a wood stove. The wash was done outside in all but the worst weather, at a fire over which a large kettle or copper boiler might be set to heat the water and the whites together, a method called boiling the wash that was even more effective at whitening than the washboard alone, but that added another hour of stirring a vat of hot water and wet clothes with a wooden paddle to the morning's labors. The farm wife also had a different relationship to time than her urban counterpart. Monday laundry was non-negotiable not just because of social convention, but because it fit into an agricultural schedule that had its own relentless logic. Monday was laundry because Sunday was the Sabbath and you didn't do heavy labor on Sunday. Tuesday was ironing. Wednesday or Thursday might be baking. The week had a rhythm, and that rhythm was not sentimental. It was a functional schedule built up over generations of experience about how to manage a household without letting any one task overwhelm the others entirely. On a working farm in 1940, the laundry was also more substantial than in a town household. Overalls and work pants ground through with agricultural soil, shirts stained with the particular combination of sweat, dirt, animal contact, and machine grease that farm work produces, children's clothes that had encountered mud and chicken yards and creek water, the kitchen linens of a household that cooked from scratch 3 times daily. Bedding for a family that might include 5, 6, 7 or more members. This was a substantial pile, and doing it by hand without electric assistance took a full day of sustained physical effort. The farm wife's reward, if you can call it that, was the satisfaction of a system that worked, a house kept running, a family clothed, a standard maintained against considerable odds. That this work was largely invisible, that it generated no income, that it was expected rather than praised. These were features of the system, not bugs as far as the system was concerned. Part 12. The city apartment. At the other end of the spectrum was the urban apartment dweller, a category that by 1940 included millions of Americans living in the cities of the Northeast, the industrial Midwest, and the growing cities of the West Coast. The city apartment laundry situation had its own particular set of complications. Where the farm wife had space and outdoor access, the apartment dweller had neither. The city apartment of 1940 was typically compact, 2 or 3 rooms in many cases, with a kitchen, a bedroom, and a combined living and sometimes additional sleeping space. There was no wash house out back. There was no yard for a clothesline, or if there was access to a yard, it was shared with other tenants, and the lines were allocated by time and schedule and a certain amount of negotiating. Many city apartments had no dedicated laundry facilities at all. You made do with the kitchen sink and bathtub. The bathtub served as the rinse tub. The kitchen sink served as the wash tub, or you filled a portable wash tub and balanced it on the counter. The wringer, if you had one, was a hand-operated model that clamped to the side of the tub. The wrung clothes went onto an indoor drying rack or were hung in whatever space was available, over the bathtub, in the hallway, wherever there was airflow. The shared clotheslines in the building's backyard or on the rooftop were a significant urban institution of this period. Access was governed by informal but widely understood rules. Monday was laundry day, and you claimed your portion of line space early in the morning, or you waited for whoever had gotten there first to finish. In some buildings, particularly those with many families in small apartments and not enough line space, there was real competition for Monday morning slots. Being the first one out with your laundry was a form of Monday morning victory. Urban laundry also introduced a class dimension that was interesting in a different way than the rural situation. In wealthier urban households, and there were wealthy urban households even in 1940, the Depression notwithstanding, laundry might be sent out to a commercial laundry service, or done by a laundress who came to the house once a week. These services existed in every major American city, and served a middle and upper class clientele that found the combination of high standards and physical impossibility of maintaining those standards in a small apartment a reasonable argument for paying someone else. The laundress, a woman, almost always and often black in northern cities where African American women were heavily concentrated in domestic service, came to the household on a regular schedule and did the washing and ironing and sometimes the mending. She was paid a daily rate. She brought expertise and physical endurance. She also brought invisibility in the social sense. Her labor was essential and her presence was regular, but she occupied the particular social position of domestic service, which in 1940 American life meant that her name might not be known to the children of the household she served, that she entered and left through specific doors, that the social distance between employer and employee was maintained with deliberate care. This was the urban laundry economy. Some women doing the work themselves in cramped and inadequate conditions, some women paying other women to do it for them, and the women being paid doing the hardest physical work for the least money and the least social recognition. Part 13. The commercial laundry. The commercial laundry was a significant industry in 1940 America, and it served a clientele that ranged from wealthy individuals who sent all their household washing out, to working-class families who sent just the shirts and collars, the most visible, most demanding, most socially legible items. Commercial laundries operated on industrial equipment that no household could afford or accommodate. Large drum washers, industrial wringers, flatwork ironers, enormous heated rollers that could iron a sheet in seconds, finishing equipment for collars and cuffs that produced results no home iron could match. The starched collar, the perfectly pressed shirt, the napkins with their sharp geometric folds, these were the products of industrial finishing equipment operated by workers who did this all day, every day, and who knew every fiber type, every stain, every trick of the trade. For a working-class man who needed to appear at his job in clean, presentable condition every day, the commercial laundry represented a practical calculation. You could send the shirts out maybe 2 or 3 at a time, rotating through the week, and pick them up finished, pressed, collared, ready to wear. The cost was not trivial on a working-class budget, but it was manageable, and it meant that Monday at home was slightly less overwhelming because the shirts were accounted for. The commercial laundry industry in 1940 was also a significant employer, particularly of immigrant women and black women, who did the washing and the ironing in hot, humid, physically demanding conditions that were a significant improvement in pay over some alternatives, but were still hard work by any measure. The flatwork ironers, the sorting tables, the large, steamy washing rooms, these were workplaces with their own social ecology, their own hierarchies of skill and seniority, their own rhythms. The Chinese laundry, which had been an institution in American cities since the mid-19th century, was still a common feature of 1940 urban neighborhoods. Chinese immigrants had established a foothold in the laundry trade beginning in the 1860s, partly because laundry was one of the few occupations that was not formally closed to them by the many legal and social barriers they faced, and partly because it required relatively modest capital investment to start. By 1940, the Chinese laundry was so embedded in American urban life that it was essentially taken for granted, a neighborhood fixture. The family-operated Chinese laundry on the corner received collars and shirts, cleaned and returned them with a quality that regular customers had come to rely on. Part 14. Tuesday was ironing day. This deserves its own consideration because ironing in 1940 was inseparable from laundry in a way it is not today. You could not simply wash the clothes and be done. The washing was only half of it. Washed and dried clothes in 1940 were often wrinkled in a way that was considered completely unacceptable for public appearance. And the garments of this period, made primarily of cotton and linen without synthetic fibers' natural tendency to shed wrinkles, required ironing to be presentable. The iron of 1940 was an electric iron in most homes that had electricity, a heavy, solid instrument, usually between 5 and 7 pounds, with a pointed front, a wooden or bakelite handle, and a flat metal sole plate that got extremely hot. You plugged it in, you set it on a wire rest, and you waited for it to heat up. You tested the temperature by sprinkling a few drops of water on the sole plate and watching how fast they danced off, a technique that required exactly the experience you thought it required. The ironing board was usually a freestanding folding board covered with a cotton pad and a clean cover, set up in the kitchen where there was room to work. Ironing standing at a full-sized board for several hours was, again, physically demanding work that produced specific fatigue in the lower back and forearms. Some women sat on a high stool, some didn't. Different fabrics required different temperatures and different techniques. Cotton could handle a hot iron, and in fact benefited from it. A hot iron on slightly damp cotton produced remarkable results. Linen required even more heat. Silk required a much cooler iron and a pressing cloth between the iron and the fabric to prevent scorching. Wool required steam or a damp cloth. Dampening of laundry before ironing was its own technique. Dry cotton doesn't iron particularly well. You needed to reintroduce a small amount of moisture, not enough to make the fabric wet, but enough to make it pliable and responsive. The traditional method was to use your fingers to flick water drops over the fabric and then roll the item up and let it sit for 20 minutes or so before ironing, so the moisture could distribute evenly through the fibers. This worked well and took practice. An item that was too wet got ironed into a steaming, slightly limp mess. An item that was too dry wrinkled back almost immediately after the iron passed over it. The shirts were the most demanding items. Each shirt required ironing in a specific sequence. First the collar inside and outside, then the cuffs, then the sleeves, then the back of the shirt, then the front panels with particular care around the buttons, then a final pass over anything that needed touching up. An experienced ironer could do a man's dress shirt in perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. A less experienced one might take 20 or 25. Over a pile of 5 or 6 shirts with the other household items interspersed, Tuesday ironing could easily take 4 or 5 hours. The electric iron had replaced the old flat iron, the heavy solid piece of iron with no heating element, heated on the stove and tested for temperature and then replaced when it cooled, but it wasn't a complete replacement of effort. It was a replacement of the particular inconvenience of heating iron on stove and managing the cooling cycle. The effort of the arm, the back, the hours, these remained. Part 15. The body behind the work. We should spend a moment with the body. The actual, specific body of a woman doing laundry in 1940, because everything else in this story flows from what that body experienced, and it's easy for the physical reality to become abstract. She woke early. She was probably between her mid-20s and mid-40s, statistically speaking, the years in which most American women were running households. She might have been up during the night with a child. She might not have slept well. She ate something, probably the same breakfast the family ate, which in most households was cooked rather than cereal from a box, which meant she'd also cooked before the laundry began. By 7 in the morning, the hauling of water had begun. Water weighs approximately 8 pounds per gallon. A full wash tub held perhaps 20 gallons. 2 tubs, one for washing and one for rinsing, represented 320 pounds of water to fill, manage, and eventually empty. She didn't lift it all at once, of course. She moved it in buckets or kettles of 3 to 5 gallons each, but she moved all of it multiple times. The posture of washing on a washboard, hunched over a tub, arms moving in the repetitive scrubbing motion, loaded the lumbar spine and the upper back consistently throughout the morning. The wringing motion, whether hand-wringing or feeding through a roller wringer, worked the forearm flexors and the grip muscles hard and repeatedly. The hanging of laundry required reaching up repeatedly with wet, heavy fabric, which worked the shoulders. The hauling of full laundry baskets, also heavy, engaged the core and legs. By midday, she had done the physical equivalent of what a modern sports physiologist might describe as a moderate to heavy workout, not a maximal effort workout, but sustained moderate exertion over 4 to 6 hours. Without a break, really. Interrupted only by feeding the children, by managing whatever household emergencies arose, by whatever her husband needed if he was home. Her hands were a particular document of this work. The hot water and soap stripped the skin's natural oils. The mechanical friction of scrubbing added abrasion. Women in this period used hand cream, cold cream, or petroleum jelly, or whatever they had, and they used it specifically because the work dried and roughened their hands in ways that made them visibly different from the hands of women who didn't do this kind of work. The roughness of a working woman's hands was both a mark of her competence and a mark of her social position. Soft, smooth hands signified that someone else did the scrubbing. By evening, if the weather had cooperated, the laundry was in and folded and put away, or in stacks ready for Tuesday's ironing. She sat down, perhaps for the first time since breakfast, and the fatigue was of a particular kind, not the nervous, edgy tiredness of a mentally stressful day, but the dense, heavy tiredness of a body that had worked steadily for 12 hours. The kind of tired that makes the chair feel like a complete luxury, that makes the sound of the radio something you can half hear without having to engage with it. That makes the ordinary texture of an evening feel, briefly, like rest. Part 16. The social life of the clothesline. The clothesline was not merely functional. It was a social space, particularly in the dense residential neighborhoods of American cities and towns where houses sat close together and yards were visible from multiple angles. Women who hung their laundry at the same time, and Monday morning, given the universality of the Monday laundry tradition, often met many neighbors hanging simultaneously, talked to each other across the lines or over the fences. This was not incidental chatter. This was the primary social exchange of the day for many women whose lives were centered on the home. You learned what was happening in the neighborhood at the clothesline. You found out about Mrs. Kowalski's husband's new job, or the situation with the Anderson children, or the problem at the school. You passed along information that was genuinely useful. The price at the butcher's had gone up. There was a good sale at the dry goods store on 3rd Street. Old Mr. Henderson had been taken to the hospital. You also, whether intentionally or not, observed each other's laundry. The state of a neighbor's wash was legible in ways that would seem almost intrusively intimate today. You could see what they were wearing. You could see the condition of their clothing, whether it was carefully maintained or showing signs of hard use that hadn't been properly attended to. You could see in the bedding something about how many people slept in the house. You could see, in the presence or absence of certain types of garments, something about the family's situation. This was not active surveillance. It was just that laundry, by its nature, is the most intimate record of domestic life, and when you hung it outside in a dense neighborhood, you were displaying that record. The communal nature of this Monday morning activity was one of the ways in which the social fabric of a neighborhood was maintained. You knew your neighbors partly because you had spent Monday mornings for years looking across the line at them. You had an accumulated sense of their household, its rhythms, its changes over time, the growth of the children visible in the changing size of the clothing on the line. When something was wrong in a neighbor's house, the clothesline sometimes told you before anything was said, the laundry not hung, the lines empty when they should be full, a disruption in the ordinary Monday rhythm. Part 17, Class in the Collar. The single most socially charged piece of laundry in 1940 America was the detachable collar. Detachable collars for men's shirts, stiff, separate, celluloid or heavily starched linen, had been declining in popularity through the 1930s as attached collars became standard, but they were still a presence in 1940, particularly among men of a certain age and certain social position. The detachable collar represented, in miniature, the entire social logic of laundry in this period, an elaborate system built around maintaining visible cleanliness while conserving the full effort required to achieve it. The logic was this: the collar was the visible part of the shirt. When a man sat at a desk or across a counter from a customer or stood in front of a classroom, the collar was what showed above the jacket. It took the most visible soiling collar ring, the darkening at the edge from the skin's oils and the residue of the day. If you could wash the collar without washing the entire shirt, you could appear clean while wearing a shirt that had been worn 2 or 3 days. This extended the life of the shirt and reduced the laundry burden. Detachable collars required their own laundering process. They were starched more heavily than attached collars. They were pressed and shaped on special collar forms. They were stored in collar boxes that kept them from being crushed. They had their own particular social associations. A man who wore a detachable collar was a man who worked with his mind rather than his hands, who sat rather than stood or labored, who was managing something rather than making something. The white collar of white-collar work was not metaphorical, it was literal. Even as attached collars became dominant in the late 1930s and 1940s, the collar ring remained the diagnostic test of whether a man's laundry was being properly done. The grayish ring at the top of the collar that formed over the course of a week's where the visible record of skin and perspiration was a clear signal of inadequate laundering. It was also a remarkably persistent stain that required pretreatment before washing could remove it, rubbing with soap and a brush or applying a paste of washing powder and water and letting it sit before the collar went into the hot water. The collar ring was, in a quiet way, one of the things Laundry Day was specifically designed to defeat. And defeating it, consistently and invisibly, was a small domestic victory that happened in kitchens and washrooms every Monday morning across America. Part 18, The Problem of Stains. Every household had its particular stain vocabulary, the specific recurring marks that life in that house reliably produced and that Laundry Day was designed to address. In a house with small children, it was the obvious things: grass, mud, food, and whatever children managed to encounter between leaving the house in clean clothes and returning in something that looks like they'd been living in a ditch. In a house with a man doing agricultural work, it was the agricultural stains: oil, grease, the green-black of certain plant saps, the particular brown of field soil, the rust of iron tools. In a house with a man doing industrial or factory work, it was machine oil and metal shavings and the gray residue of whatever process his hands had been involved in. The treatment of stains before the main wash was a category of practical knowledge that was passed along through household manuals, through women's magazines, through conversation, and through generational transmission in the same way as the other laundry knowledge. Every housewife of competence had a repertoire of stain treatments, and using the wrong one on the wrong stain could set the stain permanently, make it chemically bonded to the fiber in a way that no amount of subsequent washing would remove. The logic of stain removal in 1940 was chemical, though it was not described in those terms. Different stains were different things chemically, and they responded to different treatments. Blood, if treated immediately with cold water, came out relatively easily. Blood treated with hot water first was a problem. The heat coagulated the proteins and bonded them to the fiber. This was extremely well known. Every woman who did laundry in 1940 knew this. It was one of the first things you learned: blood comes out in cold water. The use of hot water on blood was the mistake of someone who didn't know what they were doing, which is probably why it shows up with such regularity in historical household manuals. It was common enough to require frequent correction. Grease stains required a degreaser, either a solvent like benzene or carbon tetrachloride for dry treatment, or a strong soap solution with thorough mechanical action for a wet approach. Benzene and carbon tetrachloride were common household products in 1940 and were sold specifically as stain removers, which seems alarming in retrospect since both are now understood to be toxic. But in 1940 the toxicity was not well understood or publicized and the products were widely available. Women applied them in unventilated rooms with bare hands and noticed nothing except that they removed grease from fabric, which was what they were supposed to do. Fruit stains, berry juice, peach, cherry, the entire summer fruit repertoire responded to boiling water poured from a height directly onto the stain before the fabric went into the main wash. The force and heat together broke up the tannins and anthocyanins that gave fruit its color. This was another piece of standard knowledge. Iron rust stains from the metal tubs from clothes that had been left damp for too long in contact with any iron surface. From the particular way that iron well water could stain fabric over time were stubborn and required an acid treatment. Lemon juice, oxalic acid if you had it, sometimes a commercial rust remover. Getting rust out of white fabric was a genuine challenge, and the prevention of rust stains, keeping metal surfaces away from clean laundry, drying things completely before storing, using the right kind of basin was considered important preventive care. Tea and coffee stains, in a period when both were drunk by virtually every American adult multiple times daily, were common and addressed by immediately rinsing in cold water, and then treating with a mild bleach solution for whites or with a soap paste for colors. Coffee stains that had dried were significantly harder than fresh ones. Perspiration stains, the yellowing at the underarms and collar that resulted from the combination of sweat, and whatever antiperspirant or deodorant was being used or not used, were chronic and required repeated treatment. Ammonia solution was a common approach. Pre-soaking in a salt solution before washing was another. The yellowing, once it had occurred and been allowed to set over multiple washings, was very difficult to reverse. Which is why prevention, immediate washing after heavy sweating, the use of dress shields in the underarm area of good dresses was strongly emphasized. Part 19, Dress Shields and Other Hidden Technologies. The dress shield deserves a separate mention because it represents a category of mid-century domestic problem-solving that has almost entirely disappeared. The dress shield was a crescent-shaped or oval piece of fabric, usually a soft cotton or silk on the outside, with a waterproof layer of rubber or oiled fabric on the inside, that was sewn or snapped into the underarm area of a dress or blouse. Its purpose was to absorb perspiration before it reached the outer fabric of the garment, protecting the dress from the staining and odor that perspiration produced and extending the time between full washings. Dress shields were so common in 1940 that they required no explanation in any household management text of the period. They were listed alongside the other standard household supplies, available at any dry goods store, sold in pairs in small envelopes. They were removed before washing, washed separately and reattached. A good dress, the kind worn to work or church or social occasions, might go several wearings between full washings if the dress shields were doing their job. This was not laziness, this was practical necessity. Fine fabric was expensive. The more you washed it, the more it wore. The goal was to wash things exactly as often as they needed washing, no more, because overwashing wore out fabric faster. Dress shields were an engineering solution to a bodily problem, a way to contain the most problematic byproduct of wearing clothes while keeping the garment itself cleaner longer. Men used undershirts for the same purpose. The undershirt absorbed the sweat before it reached the dress shirt, keeping the dress shirt clean enough for 2 or 3 days of wear. The undershirt then went into the wash more frequently, but undershirts were less expensive and easier to launder than dress shirts. The layering of undergarment beneath outer garment was not entirely about warmth or modesty. It was a laundry management strategy. This kind of pragmatic clothing logic was thoroughly understood and unremarked upon in 1940. Everyone knew that you wore your clothes in a specific rotation for specific purposes and that the laundering frequency was calibrated to the garment type and the level of soiling. Work clothes went in more often than Sunday clothes. Everyday dresses washed more often than good dresses. Undershirts washed with the whites. Overalls washed with the heavy soils. The whole system was designed to preserve fabric while maintaining the required social standard of cleanliness. Part 20, The Hired Help. In some households, not many, but enough to constitute a recognizable social category, there was a woman who came to help with the laundry. She was called, depending on the region, the washerwoman, the laundress, the wash lady. She was paid by the day or by the load. She brought her own expertise and was often considerably more skilled and faster than the woman who employed her, having done this work professionally for years. The washerwoman of 1940 was most commonly a black woman, particularly in the South and in northern cities with significant African American populations, and her position in the household economy was complex. She was essential, truly needed, genuinely valued for her skill and her labor, and she was simultaneously occupying one of the lowest rungs of paid employment, doing work that was physically arduous, poorly compensated, and socially invisible. She entered homes through the back or the kitchen. She was offered food in the kitchen, not the dining room. Her first name was used by her employer. Her employer's last name with the appropriate title was used by her. These were the rules, and they were observed as naturally as all the other social rules of the period. Some women had been doing laundry for other families for decades, building long relationships with the households they served, knowing the family's washing as intimately as any outsider could. They knew which brother had the worst collar stains. They knew the particular gray that crept into the father's undershirts from the factory work. They knew when a new baby had arrived by the sudden appearance of small cot items in the wash. They knew when there had been illness from the bedding. All of this knowledge was accumulated and carried and rarely spoken of. The washerwoman's own household laundry was done on a different day. The work she did for others could not overlap with her own family's washing, so she did her own on a day when she wasn't contracted out. She also dealt with her own Monday, her own pile, her own children's clothes on whatever day was left. The work did not diminish by virtue of being her own. Part 21, the smell of the house on Monday. There is a sensory texture to laundry day in 1940 that is difficult to fully reconstruct but worth attempting, because the smell and feel and sound of that day was distinctive enough to have lodged in the memory of everyone who experienced it. The smell came first. By mid-morning, a house doing laundry smelled of hot, wet fabric and soap, a combination that is clean but heavy, steamy, and slightly mineral. If the fire was going under a wash pot in the yard or the cook stove was loaded with heating water, there was wood smoke in the mix, and the sharper edge of the soap, and underneath it all the warm cloth smell of the laundry itself. Cotton and linen heated and agitated, releasing their own particular smell. It was the smell of effort. Of cleanliness being actively produced rather than passively maintained. By noon, if the weather was right and the line was full, there was the exterior smell. Air and sunlight warming the wet fabric, a smell that intensified and sweetened over the course of the afternoon as the clothes dried. People who have described taking laundry off the line in the late afternoon have consistently described the smell of sun-dried cot as one of the specific sensory pleasures of their childhoods. There is something to it that no commercial fragrance has ever quite replicated, though many have tried. It's partly UV chemistry, partly the evaporation of whatever impurities were in the wash water, partly simply air moving through fabric for hours. Sun-dried linen has a particular texture too, slightly stiffer than machine-dried fabric, the fibers standing slightly apart from each other rather than tumbled soft. It needed to be dampened and ironed to be truly finished, but before that step it had its own character. The sound of laundry day in a house with an electric washer was the rhythmic churning of the agitator, a sloshing mechanical sound that became a kind of background to the morning. In a house doing laundry by hand, the sounds were the splash and pour of water, the scrub of fabric against washboard, the squeeze and drip of wringing, the clink of the zinc washboard against the metal tub. Outside, the snap of wet fabric being shaken before hanging, the whistle of the clothespins as they slid along the line. The creak of the line itself under the weight of wet sheets. These were the sounds of the 1940 Monday morning in millions of American homes simultaneously, because almost everyone did it on Monday, and so across every residential neighborhood the sounds and smells of laundry were the sounds and smells of the week beginning, of domestic life reasserting itself, of cleanliness being renewed. Part 22, what electricity changed. The electrification of rural America was one of the great social transformations of the mid-20th century, and its effects on laundry day were among the most immediate and most felt by the people who experienced it. Before electricity, and before the electric washing machine and iron, the laundry situation was as described in the earlier sections: physically arduous, time-consuming, dependent on muscle and heat and manual agitation. Women who remembered the pre-electricity years, interviewed later in the century about the arrival of power on their farms and in their communities, described the electric washing machine in terms that might seem extravagant to modern ears. It was, they said, a transformation. It was freedom. It was the difference between a day of grinding physical labor and something that still required work and management, but that returned hours of your life. The electric washer of 1940 was not the sealed automatic machine of later decades. It was an open tub with an electric agitator, requiring manual filling, manual temperature management, manual transfer of clothes through the wringer, manual rinsing. But the agitator did the scrubbing that had previously been done by the washboard and the forearm muscles, and this difference was not small. The repetitive, sustained pressure of scrubbing fabric against corrugated zinc was replaced by the passive action of the machine moving the clothes through the water. You managed, you supervised, you fed through the wringer. You were still present and still working. But you were not destroying your knuckles or spending every Monday morning hunched over a tub. Women who had done laundry by hand for years and then acquired electric machines frequently described the first Monday with the new washer as a revelation. The work that had consumed 8 or 10 hours was done in 4 or 5. The particular ache that had lived in their shoulders on Monday night was reduced. The raw skin on the backs of their hands was no longer the price of a clean household. The irony is that as each labor-saving device was introduced, the expected standard of cleanliness and the frequency of washing shifted upward to meet the new capacity. When washing by hand, you washed as seldom as you could get away with because the effort was prohibitive. When the machine did most of the mechanical work, the expectation shifted. Clothes could be washed more often, therefore clothes should be washed more often. Therefore, clothes that were washed less often than the machine's new capacity allowed were an indication of inadequacy rather than reasonable limits. The standard moved with the technology, and the net gain in effort was less than it might have been. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of household technology, and it was observed and named by historians of domestic life beginning in the 1970s. The washing machine did not liberate women from laundry. It raised the standard of cleanliness to meet the new capacity, and it made the work of those without machines more obviously burdensome by contrast, and it contributed to a set of advertising messages that used the new standard to sell more machines and more soap and more accessories. But for the individual woman on the individual Monday morning, the machine was still better than no machine. Ask anyone who had used both. Part 23: The Economics of Clean. The budget for laundry in a 1940 American household was a real consideration that required real management. It included the cost of soap, which was purchased regularly and in quantity. It included the fuel for heating water, coal or wood or gas depending on the stove. It included, if applicable, the cost of bluing and starch and any stain removers kept on hand. It included, in families that sent things to commercial laundries, the weekly laundry bill. And it included, amortized across a longer period, the cost of the equipment itself: the washing machine, the wringer, the tubs, the iron, the ironing board. In 1940, a bar of Felsnap that cost perhaps 8 to 12 cents. A box of washing powder might be 15 cents. Bluing was perhaps a dime for a small bottle. These seem like small amounts until you remember that the average American family income in 1940 was something like $1,500 to $2,000 per year, and that grocery and household budgets were calibrated with great care. The woman managing the household budget knew what the laundry supplies cost, tracked it, and looked for sales and substitutions the way she tracked everything else. The washing machine represented a capital investment that needed to pay for itself and saved labor or saved laundry costs. If you were previously sending shirts to the commercial laundry, the cost of that could be calculated against the cost of machine and soap and electricity in your own time. If you were previously paying a washerwoman, same calculation. If you were washing by hand yourself, the calculation was more personal. How much is your time and physical effort worth? And this was a calculation that the culture of 1940 didn't always make easy for women to answer in ways that valued their labor at market rates. The durability of clothing was also an economic factor in laundry decisions. Clothes in 1940 were more expensive as a proportion of family income than they are today, and they were expected to last considerably longer. A good men's dress shirt represented a real investment, and the way it was laundered affected how long it lasted. Overwashing wore fabric out. Harsh soap damaged fibers. Improper ironing temperatures scorched fabric permanently. The skill of doing laundry correctly was not just about social appearance. It was about protecting a financial investment that couldn't be easily replaced. This is why household manuals of the period went into such detail about fabric types and appropriate washing temperatures and ironing settings. It wasn't perfectionism for its own sake. It was protecting the family's material possessions from needless deterioration. Part 24: The Ethnic Kitchen, the Ethnic Wash. American households in 1940 were far from uniform, and the variations in laundry practice mapped in interesting ways onto the ethnic and regional diversity of the American population. Polish immigrant families in the steel towns of Pennsylvania, Italian families in the neighborhoods of Boston and New York, Jewish families on the Lower East Side, Mexican families in the Southwest, Norwegian farm families in Minnesota, African-American families in both the South and the northern cities where the Great Migration had brought them. Each of these communities brought their own domestic traditions, their own soap preferences, their own timing conventions, their own standards. Some immigrant communities brought different soap traditions. In certain Eastern European households, ash-based cleaning preparations were still in use alongside or instead of commercial soap. In Jewish households with strong observance of kashrut, The separation of items used for meat and dairy extended in some interpretations to the linens and cloths of the kitchen, which introduced its own organizational requirement into the laundry sort. Italian household management traditions often emphasized different soap concentrations and different pretreatment approaches for specific stains. The Monday as Laundry Day convention was widespread but not universal. In households following Jewish religious practice, where Saturday was the Sabbath, the laundry schedule shifted. Sunday might be laundry day instead, pushing ironing to Monday. In agricultural communities where the specific rhythms of the farming calendar overrode the general convention, laundry day might move around depending on what was happening in the fields or the barn. Weather played a role in scheduling decisions in ways that a general rule couldn't fully account for. What remained constant across the ethnic and regional diversity was the basic situation: the hot water, the soap, the mechanical effort, the hanging, the ironing, and the social weight of the whole enterprise. These were shared experiences of American domestic life in 1940 that cut across many of the other categories of difference. Part 25. What the advertisers said. The advertising directed at American women in 1940 regarding laundry products was a remarkable cultural document. The soap and washing powder advertisements of the period, and they were everywhere, in women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping, and in newspaper supplements on the radio and store windows, operated on a consistent set of emotional levers. They spoke to the standards women were supposed to uphold. They presented the gleaming whiteness of a properly laundered shirt as a measure of love, of competence, of feminine worth. They presented the failure to achieve that whiteness as a source of shame. The collar ring was a particularly favorite advertising antagonist. Advertisement after advertisement from the late 1930s and early 1940s showed husbands noticing the collar ring on their shirts, or colleagues noticing, or the man himself looking in the mirror before a business meeting with dismay. The solution, invariably, was the specific soap or powder being advertised. The implication, clear enough without ever being stated, was that a collar ring was a failure of the wife, a negligence that had consequences for the husband's professional life and by extension the family's security. This was deliberate. The advertising was designed to activate anxiety rather than simply inform, because anxiety sells. A woman who felt secure in her laundry performance was a woman who might not need the specific product being advertised. A woman who felt that her current methods were potentially inadequate, that she might be embarrassing her husband without knowing it, that the neighbor whose husband's shirts always looked so bright knew something she didn't. That woman was a customer. The women's magazines of this period also ran editorial content, helpful articles about laundry methods, stain removal, the care of specific fabrics, the best way to achieve brilliant whites. This editorial content was not entirely independent of the advertising. The same magazines that told you how important your husband's white shirts were also carried full-page advertisements for the products that would help you achieve them. The commercial and the editorial reinforced each other. None of this made the advertising cynical in a way that was unusual for the period. This was simply how commercial culture operated in 1940, with less distance between advertising and editorial content than regulations would later require. But it's worth noting because the anxiety around laundry was not entirely organic. Some of it was manufactured, sustained, and amplified for commercial purposes. The women who read these magazines and heard these radio advertisements were not passive recipients of this anxiety. They were experienced, competent, practical people who also understood, on some level, when they were being sold something. But the standards they were sold, the brilliant whites, the ring-free collar, the perfectly pressed shirt, those standards were real and were really maintained Monday after Monday at real physical cost. Part 26. The Children Who Remember. History is made of documents, but it is also made of memory, and the laundry day of 1940 lives in the memories of people who were children then and who, interviewed decades later, described it with a specificity that documents cannot always capture. What they remembered with remarkable consistency was the smell. The hot soap smell of the morning, the fresh air smell of the drying clothes, the slightly different smell of the starched and ironed items that came off the board on Tuesday afternoon. The smell of the house on Monday was permanently stored in their memories as the smell of home, of ordinary life, of the week beginning. They remembered the sound of the washing machine or the sound of their mothers at the washboard, the rhythm of it, the particular sloshing cadence that meant Monday morning had fully arrived and was underway. They remembered being put to work on various parts of the process, carrying clothespins, handing up items to be hung on the line, turning the handle of the wringer if it was a hand-powered model. They remembered the specific instructions about the wringer: keep your fingers clear. They remembered being told this enough times that it became its own kind of Monday ritual. They remembered the way the house was transformed on laundry day, the kitchen given over to the work, the normal domestic activities displaced or reorganized around the washing. They remembered lunch on laundry day being whatever was quickest because there was no time to cook properly. Bread and butter, a bowl of soup if something had been left on the back of the stove, whatever required the least interruption to the work. And they remembered, some of them, the particular tiredness of their mothers at the end of Monday. Not a complaining tiredness. That would not have been the register in which a 1940 housewife was likely to express the day's weight, but a settled, profound tiredness, the kind that comes from having done something large and necessary and now being on the other side of it. The particular quality of Monday evening when the laundry was done and in, and the water was emptied and the tubs were put away, and the kitchen had resumed something like its normal identity. The week could begin, really, once that was done. Part 27, The Things That Went Wrong. A laundry day that went entirely according to plan was a good Monday. Not every Monday was a good Monday. The things that went wrong on laundry day range from minor irritations to genuine household crises. The weather turning, as already mentioned. A stain that refused to release despite correct treatment. An item that came out of the wash shrunk in wool that had met too hot water and condensed to roughly 2/3 its original size, still recognizably the garment it had been but no longer wearable by the person it had been washed for. A sock lost somewhere in the depths of the tub. A pillowcase that had developed a tear during the vigorous scrubbing and now needed mending before it could be used. More serious, the dye in a colored garment running onto lighter items in the same wash load, leaving a faint blue or red or green shadow that was not immediately obvious when wet but became clear when the item dried. A red handkerchief that survived in the wash with white undershirts turned everything pink. This was a particularly memorable kind of laundry disaster, and experienced washerwomen were vigilant about it, pre-testing new garments in a separate rinse before washing them with anything else, knowing which colors were likely to run. The wringer, if it was electric, could break down. The belt that connected the motor to the wringer rollers could slip or snap. The rollers themselves could crack. These were not exotic failures. They happened regularly enough that women knew how to manage without the wringer when needed. Hand-wringing, which is exactly what it sounds like. Taking the wet fabric in both hands and twisting in opposite directions until the water ran out, then repeating. Effective but exhausting, and considerably wetter than the machine-wrung alternative. Overstarching an item and then ironing it produced a stiff, almost cardboard quality in the fabric that was uncomfortable to wear and could crack the fabric fibers with repeated bending. This was fixable in theory. You could rewash the item to remove the excess starch, but it added work to an already long day. Scorching fabric with an iron that was too hot left a permanent brownish mark that could not be removed. Scorching a white shirt was a small domestic catastrophe, particularly if the shirt was a good one. The correct iron temperature for each fabric type was known and observed carefully, but the electric iron of 1940 did not have temperature controls in the way modern irons do. You tested by feel and by the water drop method, and you kept the iron moving so it didn't sit on one spot too long. Distraction was the enemy. A moment of looking away, a child calling, a neighbor at the door, a pot on the stove needing attention, and the iron sat too long and the linen told you about it in brown. Part 28, By evening. The day came to an end. In good weather, with a cooperative machine and nothing gone wrong, a woman doing the household laundry in 1940 might have the washing done and hanging by midday, the last of it off the line by 3 in the afternoon, the folding done by 4, the tubs emptied and put away, and the kitchen returned to its normal state by 5. By that point she had been on her feet for nearly 11 hours. She had lifted and hauled and scrubbed and wrung and hung and carried and sorted. She had managed the fire or the stove and the children and the schedule. She had made lunch. She had thought about what to make for dinner. She had perhaps gone to the store or had the store come to her. The delivery model of certain urban neighborhoods, where the butcher and the grocer still came to the door, was still operative in many cities in 1940. The dinner would need to be made. Children would need to be bathed. Homework would need to be checked. The husband, if he worked outside the house, would come home and expect the household to be in order, which it was, because it always was, because the expectation that it would be was so deeply ingrained in the social contract of the household that the alternative barely registered as a concept. What she had done today, the entire day's labor, was invisible in the way that all maintenance is invisible. The point of maintenance is that its successful completion leaves no trace. Clean laundry looks like it was always clean. Iron shirts look like they were born that way. The house that has been scoured and organized and washed and folded looks effortless, which is precisely what all that effort was intended to achieve. The achievement was real, the invisibility was also real. These two things lived together in the 1940 household without anyone particularly commenting on either of them, because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement was what it was. Closing, what the water remembers. Tuesday, the laundry was done. There was ironing still to do, the pile from yesterday's wash, now slightly damp and waiting, but the heaviest part was behind her. The house smelled of clean things. The lines outside were empty. The tubs were dried and put away. There is something worth sitting with in the accumulated weight of all this ordinary labor. Not sentiment, exactly. The women who did this work were not sentimental about it themselves, at least not usually, at least not while they were doing it. It was simply what needed doing. It was simply Monday. But from a distance, from the distance we have now, looking back across most of a century, there is a certain quality to the Monday laundry of 1940 that is worth noticing. It was, in its way, an achievement, not a celebrated one, not a compensated one, not one that left a record beyond the clean shirts in the closet and the white sheets on the bed. But an achievement nonetheless of knowledge, of physical endurance, of sustained attention to a complex and demanding task, of care for the people whose clothing you washed. The women who did this work carried it in their bodies, in the forearms that got stronger over years of it, in the lower backs that gave them trouble in their 50s and 60s, in the hands that were never quite the same after enough years of hot water and washboard. The work wrote itself on them, and they mostly didn't talk about it, because this was what you did and what you'd always done and what your mother had done and what your daughters would do. And the speaking of it would have felt, perhaps, like complaining, and complaining about the work that was yours to do was not how things were done. The water in the washtub on Monday morning, the bar of Felsnap that grated into the heat, the rhythm of the agitator or the rhythm of the washboard or the rhythm of the wringer turning, the snap of wet fabric in the morning air, the creak of the line taking the weight of the sheets, the smell of soap and steam, and then later the smell of sunlight in the cloth. These were the sensations of a life being maintained, of a family being held together by the specific, repeated physical act of cleaning the things they wore and slept in and used. There is something almost ritual in it when you look at it from far enough away. Something that belongs to the deep ordinary of human life, the daily and weekly and monthly effort to keep things clean, to restore things to a usable state, to push back against the entropy that clothing and bedding and the human body itself reliably introduce. The laundry day of 1940 is gone now, or nearly gone. The machines do it for you, sealed and automatic, while you do something else. The labor has largely been transferred to technology, which was the right thing, which reduced genuine human suffering, which gave back hours that had been spent hunched over tubs in steamy kitchens. But something went with it too, some knowledge that lived in the body, some familiarity with the specific gravity of wet fabric and hot water, some understanding of what it cost weekly to be a clean people in a difficult world. Let the cloth dry in the evening air, let the lines go slack. Let the week come in slowly as it always did over the smell of soap and the sound of water cooling in the tub. It is late enough now, the laundry is done.